So, what we did in Pasuk Dalet so far, over several weeks, we were discussing the Gemara, two Gemaras, about the party of Achashveirosh. And the first one was, we spent 3 weeks on, that he wore the clothing of the bigdei kehunah. And Rashi said it didn't mean the regular kohanim. Rashi added on that it meant the bigdei kohein gadol. Rashi added on the word the Gemara didn't say. And then the end of that same pasuk says how long the party was for. So really, my original plan was to go further and to start the next pasuk, even though I feel like I'm being rushed by some people here. But because it's Parshat Tetzaveh, which deals with the bigdei kehunah.
Excuse me, who's rushing the Rav? Who has the chutzpah to rush the Rav?
I should go back to Pascal.
So therefore, we're going to do it again, bigdei kehunah. We're going to go into bigdei kehunah for another answer. So we're going to go into a little bit of bigdei kehunah this week's parsha, and then we're going to circle around with real lumdus, and we'll use that lumdus to answer the question again. Where did Rashi know that even though the Gemara says he was lavish bigdei kehunah, Rashi added on there was the bigdei kohen gadol. So first we're going to take a step back, and we're going to start with an interesting pasuk. The pasuk says like this. It's in Vayakal, but it's a similar pasuk in this week's parsha. The pasuk, when it talks about the clothing, says in Perek Lamed Hey pasuk Yates, says "Ves bigdei asrod the sharas b'kodesh." We don't care about that for now. As bigdei hakodesh, the holy clothing, la'aron hakoyen, that's set up for Aaron hakoyen. The holy clothing for Aaron hakoyen. The as bigdei banov, and Aaron's clothing is kids' clothing, lechain, that's used for kehunah. Targum, look at the Targum's lashon here. Targum says, "Es levushay shemushay l'shamasha b'kutshay." Yastavushay kutshel Aaron, the holy clothing of Aaron, and the Yastavushay benoi l'shamasha, and the clothing of his sons that are used for the avodah. So the question that is asked on this Targum that then we're going to have to analyze is it seems to be describing analytically the two types of clothing differently. We have again the pasuk says both bigdei kehunah of gadol, Aaron is the kohen gadol, and the bigdei kehunah of the regular bigdei kehunah. When it comes to the pasuk,
the kohen hedger.
The kohen hedger. When it says the bigdei of Aaron HaKohen, it calls it bigdei ha-kodesh, the holy clothing. That's when it talks about Aaron. Uvanov, it calls it ubigdei banav lichahein, that is used for avodah. So wait a second. Bigdei kehunah gadol is not used for avodah. Bigdei kehunah bigdei joitim is not considered kodesh. Let's figure this out. So we start with a fascinating Rambam. The Rambam in Paraches of Kli Mimigdash says these words: Asa l'kohen hedget. It is forbidden for a kohen hedget l'loyshai to wear the clothing ela b'shas avodah. Now, what does that mean to wear the clothing? We have to go back for 1 second. And it says this: bigdei kehunah, the clothing of the kahanim. This means all kahanim probably. You're allowed to benefit from them by putting on clothing. You benefit from clothing. You're allowed to use it the days working on it. Even if it's not exactly during the avodah, except for what? The avnate. The avnate, which is the belt. Why? Rambam says, shatnes. That means there's a problem. Some of the clothing, the kahanim, that's both regular hedget and kohen gadol that is made of, which we're learning in this week's parsha.
They contain shatnes.
They contain shatnes. This week's parsha. So the question is, are you allowed to wear shatnes? Yeah, because since HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the tzavah in this week's parsha commandment to wear the clothing when you do the avodah, so that's it. You have no choice. In a simple phrase, it's not as simple as that we'll see tonight. It's the essay of performing the kabbonis, of using the sacrifices, it pushes aside the lois essay of don't wear klayim. Now, that's only when the guy's doing the avodah. What about when he's not using the avodah? Then the Rambam says, also l'kohen hedget, very strange word, l'loivshay el b'shas avodah. Since it's klayim, a kohen hedget is aser, it gets malchus, it even says, to wear the clothing of bigdei kehunah when it's not avodah. Why? Because if you're doing the avodah, we have this concept called a seder cholesei. But if you start walking around, there's no seder cholesei. You're not doing anything. You're just walking around. So if you're wearing the clothing that has a shatnes, you're like a regular Jew wearing shatnes. Regular Jew wearing shatnes gets punished.
Why only kohen hedget?
Oh, that's going to be obvious kasha. And the Rambam finishes, Ein hakahanim lo yishim la'avodah el atzemer pishtav avad. Now, the question that you just asked, very obvious question. I said it. We just said ourselves. The avnate is the same by the kohen hedget and kohen gadol. Both avnates contain shatnes. And by the way, as a side thing, by the kohen gadol, he has more clothing that has shatnes. Because the choishen and the ephod also has shatnes. So he has 3 problems. And the kohen hedget has 1 problem. But yet the Rambam openly states, because he said the words, an added word in the Rambam. Also the kohen hedget L'voisha because of shatnes, if he's stop walking around. So the obvious question becomes, why is a kohen gadol allowed to walk around with the shatnes clothing when he's not doing avodah? Now we understand, during avodah time, of course you're allowed to wear shatnes, because that's what we just said. I say this week's parasha. Not even a question. Not even a question. But now, why is the kohen gadol's situation different than the kohen hedget? The kohen hedget now is not allowed to wear the clothing as soon as the avodah is over. Take off your belt.
Right.
Kohen gadol allowed to walk around with his belt. Very, very obvious question. It's so obvious, this question, that not only do we not need a local person sitting here, but they're ready to borderline Rishon. The Radvaz already is asking these questions. Like, what's going on and why kohen hedget, not kohen gadol? That's the question.
Didn't the kohen gadol change his clothes when he went to the avodah?
That is Yom Kippur time. Now we're talking about regular days, yes. And Yom Kippur, he wasn't even wearing the Choshen Avdei. He wore different clothing anyway. Now, here's another Rambam. We're going to put it together. Also in Kliyah Mikdash. That's going to start beginning the answer. So again, our goal to get to tonight is to figure out the difference between kohen hedget and kohen gadol, and then understand why we know that when it said Achashveirosh wore the bigdei kehunah, when the Gemara was vague, Rashi adds on, bigdei kehunah means kohen gadol. We said, well, man, so now there's another Rambam. Parak Hey, Halacha Yud Gimel. Here it says that the kohen gadol has an obligation. I wrote down the wrong halacha. Okay. The kohen gadol has an obligation to remain in the base of Mikdash the entire day. Mikdash lo yetze, that's probably the pasuk. It's machlok with the sources. Right. From the Mikdash he shall not leave. He belongs in the base of Mikdash 24/7. That's his job. 24/7 in the base of Mikdash. So someone will learn. The Radvaz wants to learn this. The kohen gadol.
Which day?
All days.
He's never there.
Why are you saying that?
On Yom Kippur, you said.
No. He's there all day. He's in the base Mikdash every day. He's allowed to be taken in the beginning. The Mishnah in Yuma says he's the first one to take. Yom Kippur is when he has an obligation to do the avodah that no one else can do. We'll get to that soon because it comes up big nafkamina. But Kohen Gadol is obligated miyuchad on Yom Kippur. But every day he could do whatever avodah he wants, and he's there anyway. He can decide not to do the avodah. But it says the Kohen Gadol gets to choose first, and before the raffles, he gets to choose first. So the Kohen Gadol has an obligation to stay the whole day in the base of Mikdash. So someone will learn like this. Someone will understand. The Radvaz sort of says this, that a Kohen Gadol, the reason why he's in the base of Mikdash the whole day is because he's on call 24/7. He's on call 24/7. His job is to be available to do service at any moment. So because he has a job to be available for 24-hour service all the time, he's allowed to walk around with Avdei all the time with the shatnes. Why? Because he's on call 24/7. He doesn't have a job that I work part-time as a rabbi of a synagogue, and people think he works full-time, so they bother him. So it's not a part-time job to be Kohen Gadol, it's a full-time job. 24/7, you're on call. You're on call 24/7. You got to be dressed apart.
Right.
You have to, like by the firemen, they go down the pole, they put on their clothing, but they should be wearing it full time. They should wear the fire outfit the entire time. Don't waste time. So since they're on call entirely, since they're on call 24/7, the Kohen Gadol becomes permitted to wear shatnes the entire time. A kohen hedget is not on call 24/7. Even the days of the year when he's on call, even the days when he's in the base midrash, he's only there to do the service.
Right.
The only to do the service is fine.
He's
the
only there for the avodah.
For the avodah, the moment you step away from the avodah, take your clothing off. You're not on call 24/7. So therefore, it's a very simple answer they want to say. Why did the Rambam say specifically osir for a kohen hedget to wear the clothing that has shatnes? What are the kohen gadol is wearing shatnes also? Answer number one is very simple. Kohen hedget is not allowed to wear shatnes. Why? He's only there to do the avodah. If the avodah is over, you got no head to walk around shatnes. A kohen gadol is not there for the avodah only. He's on call 24/7. He's about to do the avodah. Since he's always about to do the avodah, since at any second it could be involved, he's on call 24/7. Call 24/7. He's allowed to wear the shatnes because that means he's doing the mitzvah the entire time. That's all related to the concept of how you look at the levush. If we stop right here, we have a very idea. Both the kohen gadol and the kohen hedget can wear klayim, and they can wear klayim only during the avodah. The difference between them is the kohen gadol's avodah is 24/7, and the kohen hedget's avodah is only b'shas the avodah. The difference that results is, do they have to take the clothing off as soon as the avodah is over? But the clothing is an avodah tikadin. When you avodah, how much of it, that determines the amount of time you're allowed to wear it. So the kohen hedget, the Rambam says, listen, buddy, you're only allowed to wear it during the avodah. Avodah is over, get out of here. Take the clothing off. You can't walk around with shatnes. The kohen gadol has 24/7. But there's another lumdus.
You don't say it because it only says l'chaim by edit.
L'chaim?
L'chaim.
Oh. No, we're going to get that in a minute. Yes. Now, there's another approach by the Achronim. The Lamdash Achronim say like this. They say, no, that's understanding that be'etzem, The kohen gadol's clothing and the kohen hedge's clothing are the same thing. They're both worn for the avodah, and the fight, the disagreement, the difference between them is one is the avodah. But there's another way to do it. And that's based on the Ramban in this week's parsha, while we're discussing this again. The Ramban adds on a word when he discusses. We have discussed in the past that the same phrase in this week's parsha appears twice. Lechavod u'leseferes. Both by kohen gadol and by kohen hedges. Both times, it's covered. But the Ramban writes, by the kohen gadol, what's with this funny clothing he's wearing? He calls it the kavod of kings. He's supposed to look different than the rest of the nation. He's above, not a kohen hedges. The kohen gadol is above the rest of the nation. He's supposed to be above everyone, and therefore he wears clothing like a king. So someone has said like this. They want to say, the difference between the kohen gadol's clothing and the kohen hedges' clothing is not that they're the exact same thing, it's a timing issue. The difference is what is the purpose and what is the obligation of the clothing. According to their alumnus is this. The kohen gadol's clothing is there to serve the kohen gadol to make him look different. The clothing is set up for a different oifen. And when he puts on this clothing, it's a mitzvah itself. It's a mitzvah itself. Because he is supposed to separate himself from the average people. So he has to put on the special garb, the royal clothing. By putting on the royal clothing, he's fulfilling his obligation of looking different than the rest of the nation. The kohen hedget doesn't have this royal garb. The kohen hedget has to wear certain clothing, a uniform for the job. So you put on your police uniform when you're doing the job. When you're not doing the job, take it off, especially if it has climb in it. The kohen gadol's climb is not an avodah dikadin. According to the first answer, it was all avodah. Question is timing. According to this answer, it's two different things completely. The kohen gadol's clothing is there l'chavir l'teferes, to look like a king, to be a king, to separate himself. It's a mitzvah in itself to wear the clothing, as opposed to the kohen hedget. It's not a mitzvah. He has no obligation to put on the clothing. If he's taking a day off, he's in bed, he's not feeling well, don't put on the clothing. You should not put on the clothing. That's climate. The kohen gadol is supposed to have the clothing on as much as possible. What the chiddush nor of this answers is this. We have discussed many times in this class, many times, that we agree that there are 613 mitzvahs. We don't really, everyone agrees, but most agree. The Rambam questions, where do we know 613 from? What are the 613? Tremendous debate. The Geonim, the Rishonim, they're all fighting what goes into 613. And it's based on the rules they have. The Rambam wrote a whole sefer. He wrote a whole introduction, 14 rules of what defines something. So we discussed a couple weeks ago how things that were not forever, if they're only in the time of the midbar, doesn't get counted for the 613.
14 rules, what define what?
14 rules to define what's its own mitzvah that gets listed or not. So, for example, to slaughter a sacrifice, you have 4 things. You have to slaughter it, capture the blood, walk the blood over to the altar, and spray it. Is that 1 mitzvah or 4? The Rambam said that'll count as 1 because it's steps in one avodah. But he gives lists. He says steps don't count as separate things. Anything that occurred in the desert that was not going to be long term doesn't count. Doesn't get counted as 613. It's still a mitzvah. Doesn't count. Leaving over the mun. I think we discussed once here. We discussed about the building of the Aron. All these things become a question. And everyone has their own shittas. The Rasag, beside you going, when he writes the 613 mitzvahs, he writes as a mitzvah for the kohen gadol to wear clothing. So all the achronim ask him, what do you kohen gadol wear clothing? Why are you adding the word gadol? Your question was, why did the Rambam say before? Why did the Rambam say before you have to take your clothing off kohen hedge, not kohen gadol? Here they have the reverse. A kohen gadol has a mitzvah to wear clothing. So everyone says, what do you need the mitzvah with kohen gadol? Mitzvah kohen hedge also. What's the difference? But according to the Lamdas we're saying now, there's a big difference. The kohen gadol has a mitzvah to wear clothing in itself. The clothing in itself becomes a mitzvah because it's about the person looking different. That's a 24/7 mitzvah. That has nothing to do with the avodah. If he wakes up one day and he's in the Beis Hamikdash, like he asked, he's allowed to be there. He's there on a regular Thursday. He said, you know what? Today I'm not doing any avodah. He still puts on the clothing. The kohen gadol has a mitzvah to put on the clothing to separate himself from the looks of it. So he has to put it on. That's why there's a mitzvah irrelevant to the avodah. If a kohen hedget knows one day he's not feeling well and he's not coming to the Beis Hamikdash, or he comes to the Beis Hamikdash, he's not doing avodah, take the clothing off. Also to be wearing the clothing, you have shatnes in it. There's no heter, there's no avodah. The kohen gadol's heter is always when you are wearing clothing because you have a mitzvah to wear clothing. And now, let's go to the Tag Mitzvah remind me of. Let's look at the pasuk. This lumdus is beautiful. It's found in the pasuk. The pasuk says, "As bigdei hakodesh la'aron hakohen," the holy clothing of Aaron the kohen gadol. There's bigdei banov, the children's clothing lechain, which serves them, which is used for service. Lechain is used for service. This makes perfect sense because there is a difference between them. The kohen gadol clothing is itself as a special concept of the mitzvah of wearing it. It might even have special kedusha. It's a special kedusha because it's not totally in the avodah. It's not based on the avodah. The guy knows what he still has to do it. But the kohen hedget, he doesn't have kedusha. It's a hechatimsa. So if you have under the service, the same way we're not going to count slaughtering, capturing the blood, walking the blood, spritching the blood as 4 separate avodas, because otherwise the mitzvahs are unlimited. We don't count wearing the clothing. Because the wearing the clothing is part of the service. So service gets called one mitzvah. One mitzvah, 613, is called service. Within the service is multiple steps. But it's called the service one. The kohen gadol doesn't have a service one. He has a wearing clothing one. It's irrelevant to the service. Because it itself is chashuv. The difference might be in halacha, what you do once you don't have to, what level of clothing is it? Is the stuff lekatchay, the word it says about bigdei hakodesh, means it has the chefs of kedusha. There are 2 types of kedusha when you learn through Shas. There's something called kedusha guf, something called kedusha dam. If I decide to give this table to the Beis Hamikdash, the table doesn't have a sanctity to it by itself. What it means is I'm giving the value of the table. I give the table to these guys, and they figure out how to sell it. But if I give a certain animal, let's say, that's slaughterable, it's a kosher animal, or I give wine that could be used for a libation, that's the word, then these things itself inherently become holy, and it becomes different halachas on how to treat them. It's possible to say, it's a long sugya enough for tonight, that the kohen gadol's clothing has kedushas haguf. It's a separate standalone thing. But the kohen hedget's clothing is only service stuff. It's a policeman's uniform. The guy retires, throw it in the garbage. The difference between, as we say in fractal, tzitzis and tefillin. Tefillin is inherently kosher, inherently kosher. So tefillin you can't throw in the garbage, chashon. Tzitzis, not everyone's knowing that way, but you could technically throw the tzitzis in the garbage. It's a chetz mitzvah. So a chetz mitzvah doesn't mean much. I'm not saying it's nothing. But the clothing is used in the, yarmulke is used in the service of mitzvah. So it doesn't get its own thing. What was our original kasha? Now what we did so far is, we're answering the Rambam. The Rambam saying, asal a kohen hedget, because a kohen gadol, not he has a mitzvah all the time to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. He has a mitzvah to wear in the clothing. And we keep on saying, asay doichel lois asay. So anytime you have the asay of, whatever it's going to be in a second from now, you push aside the client. So according to the first answer we gave, the asay was service. Kohen gadol has 24-hour service, kohen hedget has 5-hour service. After 5 hours, take it off. But according to them, we're not saying that. It's not the service. The kohen gadol wearing the clothing every second he wears is mekayim mitzvah. Like the Rasak said, there's a mitzvah to wear clothing. The mitzvah of a kohen gadol wearing clothing pushes aside the shatnes. The kohen hedget doesn't have a mitzvah to wear clothing, so what's he putting on shatnes for? Oh, when he does service. So when you do the service, you can wear it. If no more service, you can't. Because the Rambam says, Israel came late, that it's a kohen hedget must take off his clothing because of shatnes right away. We said the kohen gadol also has shatnes in his clothing. So now we go back to our question. According to what we're saying now, there's an inherent kedusha, an inherent holiness to the wearing of kehunah gedolah. An inherent kedusha, we're saying it so far that the clothing is infused with special sanctity. Might not be able to get rid of it the same way. It has special, can't just put it in the garbage. It has special holiness. So now what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, Achashveirosh is running a party, and the Gemara says he put on bigdei kehunah. He put on bigdei kehunah. Rashi says, by the way, bigdei kehunah means kohen gadol. We asked right away. Bigdei kehunah means all kahanatic clothing. Doesn't say kohen gadol. Rashi's adding on a crucial word there. Going to say that makes perfect sense because it was what Aronovich was saying a couple weeks ago, but added on in depth. Achashveirosh is putting on the clothing for what? To say ich bin du, I'm chashuv. So that clothing is only when you're wearing clothes that's inherently chashuv. If you put on inherently clothing chashuv, a kohen gadol's clothing that has special sanctity to it, then you say ich bin chashuv. But is it chashuv to put on a police uniform if you're not doing any avodah? The kohen hedget's clothing has no sanctity to it. It's a police uniform. It's not when you're going to do the avodah, put the police uniform on. If you're not doing avodah, take it off. Not doing avodah, you're mechuyev to take it off. You're mechuyev because it has shatnes in it. Achashveirosh doesn't give about shatnes, but you're mechuyev to take it off. Why? Because why you're wearing the clothing. I'm walking around with the clothing. So what he says is now what Rashi was telling us. By the way, you want to know why he's putting on the clothing? Achashveirosh to show off. Showing off could only exist in a world where he's wearing inherently chashuv stuff. Otherwise, why is it different than my suit? My $9 suit is no different than a Kohen's $9 police uniform. Who cares? I'm not showing off. If I'm not a police officer, and everyone knows I'm not, and I put on a police uniform, so it's Purim. Achashveirosh didn't he made Purim in the end, Achashveirosh, but that wasn't the original plan. So he's sitting and putting on the clothing. So the only way to show off is to put on a clothing that's inherently chashuv. So therefore Rashi said, you want to know Achashveirosh putting on the clothing? Because he wants to look chashuv. Aronovich said last time because it was more valuable. Is that what you said last time? We're saying now the more value is not necessarily what we said last time, because it had gold in it. That's what we said last time. The inherent value of showing off, because the kohen gadol's clothing had gold, kohen hedge's clothing had no gold. That's a good answer. Now we're saying it's not the physical value of the clothing. It's the spiritual concept of what it represents. The Rasag says there's a mitzvah to put on kohen gadol. Achashveirosh is saying, Ich bin du, I'm putting on this mitzvah. Kohen hedge doesn't have that. So we started this again a few weeks ago, of how do we, Rashi, first we discussed a few weeks, but we discussed that question. Where does Rashi know that the Gemara doesn't say the word kohen gadol? The Gemara says bigdei kehunah. So how does Rashi know bigdei kehunah means bigdei kehunah gadol?
It goes along with the fact that we wanted to recreate the throne. We wanted the kedusha, not...
That was a different one. Yeah, we gave different answers. All along the same answer. Now, that's all going right now on the Yesod, that when it comes to the kohen gadol, there's an actual value to the clothing, a spiritual value, as he said, and the kohen hedge's clothing is a uniform. It's a better way, I like the word. It's a uniform. It's a uniform to put on. And if you're not doing the job, by the way, I'm not sure if a police officer is off duty, I don't know what the official law is. Is he allowed to walk around in his uniform?
No.
He's not allowed, right? He's not. Why? Because the uniform is only there to do the job. The uniform is there for the job.
Did you dress up on form of the kohen gadol?
So now we have. Well, the question if we had the real clothing, it would be an issue.
If it looks the same.
So, I hear.
Obviously not. The shatnes, I'm not talking about the shatnes. But you make it look the same.
Maybe. So now if we stopped right here, we have a tremendous share, and we had good pizza, and we have a real Lamdasha thing. We're giving two new answers now. It's one new answer on Achashveirosh, two new differences in an answer to the Rambam. The Rambam again said that also for a kohen hedge to wear the clothing outside the avodah. We said, why only kohen hedge? Everyone has shatnes. So the first answer is a timing issue, and really the clothing of the kohen hedge and the clothing of kohen gadol, there's no difference between them. They're both in the service. They're both service industry clothing. So they're both there for service. The question is, when is the service? Okay, that's the first answer, and then this would not apply to Achashveirosh. But according to the second Lamdasha approach, that the difference between is not based on when there is service, but on the inherent kedusha of it, we now move it over to answer Achashveirosh. So we tie in this week's parasha and Esther, which was still on Pasuk Daled. Anyway, we're going to close it up now. We're going back to the original question. Why? The original question tonight answers the original question. Why did the Rambam say only kohen hedge has to take his clothing off right away? Because of shatnes. Kohen gadol also has shatnes. We gave two answers. Either they're the same, kohen gadol and kohen hedge, but it's totally in this man, or there's a difference between them. One's clothing is more impressive than the other one's clothing. We used that second answer to explain Achashveirosh. That was all going kohen gadol's clothing versus kohen hedge's clothing. Then within kohen hedge's clothing, we went down a notch and we said, let's have another cloud. What is the reason the kohen hedge has to wear it? Is it the person has to be wearing it, or the avodah needs it? And we're left with a question on that one. Have a great night. We have 10 people for Ma'ariv. Let's do it.